Okay, let's do our sound check. How's that? Is that sounding okay? Sounds good. All right. We're going to go ahead and get started. Let me get my camera set up here. Yeah, that looks good. All right. So we're on chapter two. The name of chapter two is Booze and Blackmail. So, just to set the scene for you, these first few chapters are all about general themes. And the general themes are blackmail involving sex of all kinds and the use of the blackmail in the big scheme of things. So, she's picking different facets of our history and illustrating the criminality in a particular subject and the blackmail techniques that's used. And this particular chapter deals a lot with prohibition. And this was my first understanding of how Canada played in it because they basically implemented prohibition before us. And I'm gonna do some conspiracy, here. One of the things that we have to keep in mind when we build this framework is a lot of the impetus for international fascism, one world order, unlike what we've been told, comes from the British Round Table, the Fabian Society, and the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the CFR. So if you keep those structures in mind as being behind the scenes, well, it would make a lot of sense that if your end goal is to break up honest alcohol industry in the United States, that you would implement if you're Britain and your whole impetus is creating the Federal Reserve and basically recolonizing America under your thumb, that you could introduce a subject like prohibition in Canada kind of as a roadmap and then have it seep down into the United States. And because very few other countries went through this, it's almost like it was on purpose. I'm just going to lay that out there for you. So we also came across the Bronfman's family, Bronfman. For those of you who have followed Q Post and the national news for that matter, where the Nexium sex cult came in and you had the Seagram's girls involved in that. Um, that they're from the Brofman family. Their alcohol conglomerate was part of Seagram's. So the all of this touches what we have went through in the last few years in an amazing way. So you have Samuel Brofman, who was one of North America's top liquor magnates, and he previously had pursued a career in law. He was Jewish and he was called in Yiddish a name that translates into whiskey man. He and his brothers built a empire based off of alcohol. So their parents, Mendel and Yeshel Brockman, brought the family to Canada from Bessarabia, which is modern day Moldova and Ukraine. It's amazing how these ethnic Ukrainians keep showing up in all of these stories. So they had been a well-off family in Ukraine. They were they brought with them servants and their own personal rabbi when they moved to Canada. So, obviously well off. They had been tobacco farmers in Ukraine, and definitely Canada doesn't lend itself to that. So he's goes into manual labor, ends up being in the trading business. And Sam's son, Edgar and Charles, for a large part of their childhood, had no idea what their dad actually did. So in theory, there's this large, sense of shame that supposedly these authors write about, and she references them in the book, of knowing where their wealth came from. Sam Brofman went to great lengths to, um, hide where he got his wealth, um, he to go so far as to even say he was born in a different year and on a different date. So, he felt ill at ease as his status as an immigrant. Um, he didn't wanna talk about that, kept a lot of it, as I said, from his kids. In the 1890s, as he sampled spirits in a dingy saloon after selling off some horses, he got an idea. He got the idea of going into hospitality, i.e., buying hotels and liquor sales. So the Brofmans had saved enough money to get their first lease on a hotel in Manitoba in 1903. After 1903, they acquire several hotels throughout Canada in Yorkton, Saskatchewan, Winnipeg, and they begin turning a small profit. Largely thanks to Sam's brother Harry, who is the businessman, they were able to, even during World War One, to stave off financial problems and legal problems because they had set up gambling facilities in many of the hotels. Sam formally joins the family business in 1907, and he gets into the hotel management side of it. So, locals allege that the Brahmins were guilty of violating local liquor laws and condoning illegal gambling in their hotels. Almost sounds like they're part of the mafia because that's exactly what they did. The the So Abe Brofman, another one of the family, was very well known throughout Canada for his gambling habits. And he was a big source of financial problems for the family overall. So Sam joined the family business, the organization that would eventually bring prohibition to Canada also emerged, called the Social and Moral Reform Council. It, with Protestant churches, Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Royal Templars of Temperance, um, all created kind of a social movement, if you will, um, to target alcohol consumption. But I would also, if you do any research into this, it takes on a lot of the appearance of fake social movements, like we've seen here. When you have not organic efforts to push social reform that financially benefits a very few people. So if you have a monopoly on alcohol and you create, um, or you're trying to get a monopoly on alcohol, and you're trying to drive your competitors out of business, you would seek some type of prohibition because when they drafted the law, and we'll learn about this in a few minutes, they created a caveat for medicinal purposes. Well, it just so happens that the Brofmans, in all of their strategically placed hotels, set up drugstores that sold no drugs, just medicinal alcohol next door. So the council and its allies managed to successfully appeal to many of the Canadians under the moral depravity of drinking. And most of Canada's provinces enacted some sort of alcohol ban in the 1918 timeframe. Canada's liquor industry was substantial and felt long after it was repealed, with 75% of its breweries closing by 1928, but not the Brofmans. So, what's interesting to note about this too is the source of a lot of the alcohol at the time was from Britain and Ireland. So those connections only grow with the Brofmans into like a monopoly over time. So Great Britain dramatically benefited from this prohibition because they never stopped selling the alcohol. They just had a conduit in and didn't have to compete because they had a closed market, most of which was monopolized by the Brahmins. So, um, federal prohibition, um, we talked about the medicinal. So, Harry Brofman's new enterprise was called Canada Pure Drug Company, and that's the drug, like the drugstore that was set up next to all of their um, hotels. So, also, the Brofman's family prohibition era success forged ties to Hudson Bay Company, a dominant force in Canada's economy backed by political and economic elite of England that went back to the 1600s. So, according to an author, Nicholas Fate, Hudson, excuse me, Hudson Bay trusted Sam Brofman implicitly after he had refused to make any profit on a couple thousand cases of Dewar's whiskey that Hudson's wanted to buy back from him. And because of that, they that's the excuse anyway. They created this long-term cooperative working arrangement because Hudson Bay Company had been a dominant force in Canada's liquor industry. Harry Brofman quickly gained the reputation as, quote, the king of bootleggers, unquote. So, just as the drinking in England was kind of tapering off and they were losing significant um, revenue because people weren't as interested in drinking in England, you have the prohibition kick in Canada, which drove up demand because it was one of those um, things that you get. So, British Columbia's Prohibition Commissioner, Walter Finley, was caught engaging in and profiting from illegal liquor trade. At his trial, the existence of, quote, a liquor delivery service ran by Hudson Bay Company, unquote, that sent alcohol to private addresses that spanned the nation was revealed. It's always the people in charge telling you what you can't do while they're doing it. So behind this story was Sam Brofman and the Hudson Bay Company, the dominant distillers of England and Scotland, and that held great sway over the company's liquor subsidies, would be critical to Brofman's success during and after Prohibition. So soon after Canada's prohibition stopped, guess what happened? The US implemented prohibition because they were able to achieve in Canada exactly what they wanted in the monopolistic control of alcohol. So we're going to do it here. Those are my words. So that happened in 1920. The Brofmans, now largely under Sam's leadership, continued to import American liquor at incredible quantities, but at a much cheaper rate given the new law. So they're bringing um, the liquor that had already been manufactured in the US into Canada. They're watering it down and reselling it as bootleg liquor. The Brofmans made so much money that they began building their own distilleries near Montreal. They named the new venture Distillers Corporation Limited, the same name as the then unrelated and significantly more prestigious Scottish company that included the top 5 whiskey and gin producers in the Isles. So the name Brofmans had chosen was no coincidence. They did that on purpose so that they had immediate name recognition. And subsequently, or maybe a part of, um, they entered a joint venture with the Scottish firm, and the two companies united under the name Distillers Corporation Limited. Their union also allowed Brofmans to secure the exclusive rights to import many of the top brands from across the pond, i.e., Britain. A decade later, in the 30s, Samuel Brofman purchased and built a number of distilleries in Scotland, further deepening the ties between Britain and the Brofmans. Brofmans secured this deal at the time, likely owing to Sam's pre existing ties to the Hudson Bay Company, which was their distribution network in Canada. So one of Brofman's middlemen was the name Louis Rosenthal, who supposedly there's a meeting between Louis Rosensteel and Winston Churchill in 1922. A year later, Brofman traveled to Kentucky, where Rosensteel was based at the time, and purchased an ailing distillery, the components of which was then shipped north and used to create Brofman's first distillery. Churchill had deep family and personal ties to the Hudson Bay Company from 1919 to 1922, he was also in charge of Britain's colonial office, which, for those of you who don't know, is basically like their um, Secretary of Commerce for all of their colonies, which would have included Canada, um, all of the British Empire. The Britain's colonial office basically was their empire Secretary of Commerce. So Churchill refused to use British authority or influence to interfere with the liquor trade in the British colonies. British dominated Rum Row, where the Brofmans were also active. Churchill argued that England was not obligated to enforce laws of another nation, and would later call prohibition as a policy an affront to the whole history of mankind. So basically, he's saying that because he was in Britain, he didn't need to recognize the Canadian prohibition law or the US prohibition law. That was their problem. He's going to ship whatever he wants to ship wherever he wants to ship it and screw everybody else. As the Brofmans family clout in the liquor grew, Sam Brofman would later manage to personally meet Queen Elizabeth II and create a whiskey called Crown Royal. Don't you just love that? Nat Crown Royal commemorated her visit to Canada in 1939. So Distillers Company Limited, the Brofmans Distillers, Company purchased Joseph E. Seagram's and Sons Limited. That's the name of the company. Joseph E. Seagram's and Sons Limited. They had a distillery in Waterloo, Ontario, which they purchased and merged the company, Seagram's Company Limited, with the Brothmans' now um, liquor empire. The empire continued to grow, including purchases of chemical companies, oil companies, and entertainment companies. Sam Brockman's rise from the global liquor baron also depended significantly on the ties he had forged through other middlemen in the North American organized crime. He dealt with, and there will be in the future chapters coming up more information on this, but some of the people that he came in contact with was Lucky Luciano, Mole Dalitz, Abner Zwellman, Meyer Lansky, and members of the Detroit's Purple Gang. So, excuse me. Um, Also, in the hotels that the Brofmans began to acquire, there was a lot of rumors about them being brothels. So there was gaming going on. There was the prostitution that was involved, and this is what his entire empire um, has been built on. The murder of a Brofman brother-in-law turned associate and the promise of more lucrative markets in the Brofman booze industry soon drew attention to their enterprise. Quote, "We were late starters in the two most lucrative markets on the high seas and across the Detroit River. What came out of the border trade in Saskatchewan was significant by comparison." Unquote. That was said by Brofman during an interview with a reporter. And despite being late to the game, this was when they started to make their real money, according to Brofman. The bootlegging operation of the Brofmans went far beyond Canada and the US. The family established warehouse fronts throughout Canada and Mexico, basically encircling the United States like prey. The 1934, the Brofman brothers were charged with conspiracy to, quote, "to violate statutes of a friendly country," unquote, and for evading taxes on liquor that they had exported out of Canada. Sam Brofman basically destroyed tons of documents once those charges were made and that tied his company to smuggling. And basically, he began moving assets around as if they had vanished. And that's why I was telling y'all, all of these entities like this, they have a trust where they can keep assets anonymous. They have a bank that they can money launder their ill-gotten gains from, and they all seem to have these traits. They just mysteriously lose money, in an insurance company for when they need to burn things down, literally. So the companies tied to smuggling and their assets would all mysteriously vanish. The case against the Brofmans ran into an insurmountable roadblock, and the four Brofman brothers were acquitted on all charges. Ooh, big surprise. Y'all just think our justice system today is broke. Our justice system has been broke for a very long time. They negotiated a $3 million settlement with the Treasury Department, which was a fraction of what they made during the Prohibition time. Brofman's mob associates that were tied to the National Crime Syndicate that we talked about earlier was investigated in a 1950 Senate investigative body called CAF um, Kefauver, Kefauver, Kefauver Committee, as a confederation of organized crime interests then dominated by the Italian American Mafia and the Jewish American mob. And we talked about the components of that in our first chapter. So, Mafia, um, along with Brofman, were central figures in all of the bootlegging operations. A cozy relationship with Meyer Lansky had occurred. Lansky's wife later recounted how Brofman had thrown lavish dinner parties for her husband. Um, and in 1923, when Lansky bought Sam prize tickets to the boxing championship between Jack Dempsey and Louis Burpo in New York, Lansky would, among other things, offer exclusive protection to all of Brofman's booze shipments. So he was in bed with the mafia. Lansky apparently bitter that, in it, so later, Lansky, when he got old, apparently bitter that Brofman had managed to launder his post-prohibition reputation into that of an upstanding aristocrat, but yet Lansky always suffered under the gangster label, made him mad. Um, The first person who attempted to write a biography on Samuel Brofman, Terence Robertson, who traveled to New York to investigate Brofman and then sprawling corporate empire of Seagram's, um, allegedly concluded the book, but had telephoned a journalist colleague in Canada saying that he was upset because they didn't want him writing about Sam. His life was threatened, um, and he called another friend who called the New York police, who responded, but found Robinson had been poisoned with barbiturates and was dying. So supposedly the manuscript still exists, but it's never been published, which is interesting. And we've learned throughout all of our digging that, um, a lot of the brave journalists who do report truth end up dead. That may be why so many of them are corrupt. They'd rather be paid than be brave. Subsequent attempts to author, a biography on Sam Brofman were also, stopped from being publicized or published. So the former editor of the Canadian version of Time magazine, John Scott, uh, and another journalist, Erna Parrish, tried doing so. But some books did get published, but they didn't really like, anything negative being published about them. The Brofmans apparently didn't take kindly to a portrayal of them by Peter Newman or Mordecai Rickler, both of whom were Jewish, prompting the family behind Seagram's to allege that both authors were anti Semitic Jews. So, see, that story has been around for a long time too. You can even be Jewish and not allowed to criticize other Jewish people without being called anti-Semitic, which to me means that's a made up, um, slur that is used by people to avoid accountability for their bad actions. You just it's like calling black conservatives racist, or white, um, because they're saying there's something wrong with the government. Once you do that the first time, you lose all credibility. That crap can't be tolerated. And then, unfortunately, what you end up doing is if somebody actually is a racist, you've destroyed their ability to get justice because you destroyed the entire, which I think is what their end purpose is to be quite honest with you. Fascists has made it quite clear they hate black people. They in their written documentation in the late 1800s, there was no Pan Africa concept. Africa was always going to be their slave colony. They said it. They said those exact words. So the fact that they destroy the ability for any black person to seek justice when they are honestly discriminated against by making a mockery of racism feeds into their narrative because they have no intentions of those people actually having equal rights. They don't see them as equals. Ugh. So, under the sublabel the middlemen, and there's a bunch of them. So we're going to kind of run through some of them just so you're familiar with the names. We have Joseph Reinfeld, um, along with Louis Rosenthal. These two men, very different. Reinfeld was a jovial, funny Jewish immigrant from Poland. Rosenthal was a very loud, nasty person. Reinfeld, ends up being a very close advisor to Sam Brofman, helped him with the purchase of Seagram's, built up inventory both during and after Prohibition. He managed a lot of the in-person dealings with the Brofmans, empire, um, and let's see. It was Reinfeld that brought Sam Brofman into contact with many of the notorious mobsters, and their syndicate. One of which was Longy Z um, Zielman, who Reinfeld had sent to negotiate directly with, Brofman. They were very impressed with him, even though he was in his early 20s, he was well behaved, and, Reinfeld's operation during Prohibition was massive and raked in a lot of money. So the government investigators revealed that Reinfeld had imported nearly 40% of all illegal alcohol consumed in the United States during Prohibition. The Bromsfield family, with Reinfeld's main supplier, the Bromsfield family was his main supplier. So the use of Canadian institutions as money laundering for Reinfeld is very likely. The involvement of Royal Bank of Canada in Rum Row, um, which is where Reinfeld received the shipments of the liquor. There were also shell companies set up, both foreign and domestic. The close association with Bronsfeld and Reinfeld would later come back to haunt both of them. Reinfeld's long term bodyguard, James Rutkin, testified in front of the Kefauver Committee in the 1950s. Rutkin would tell all regarding the early days of the business and them basically running illegal liquor. Rutkin's claim regarding the Brofmans, several pertained to the family hotel business in Canada that had preceded the liquor empire, saying that the Canadian mounted police and they will tell you about the little hotels and you can use your imagination. He later added that these hotels serviced people who slept fast. Those was his quotes, meaning they were brothels. Um, he later added that these hotels serviced, oh, excuse me. Um, the family biographer also mentioned these accusations, which had dogged the family in the earliest years. And Sam Brockman is quoted as saying, if they were brothels, they were the best in the West. They just love laughing at you. Um, he said that the claims were not true, but they were persistent. And when you look at the fact that we do know that they were using the drugstore set up next door to supply alcohol to the hotels, um, and the fact that they were running illegal liquor, and they had gambling facilities inside the hotels. It's not a stretch to think that there was prostitution going on there too. These other middleman, Louis Rosenthal, who we talked about a few minutes ago, said his relationship with the chairman was on a completely different trajectory. Rosensteel and Brofmans would grow into bitter rivals eventually. In a 1959 piece in Esquire, offered one of the more favorable accounts, calling Rosensteel intelligent, articulate, and extraordinarily aggressive. Um, he was a very nasty person. The New York Times obituary for Rosenthal used similar terms, referring to the liquor baron known to many as the chairman, as having been a domineering man with a quick temper. He built his company called Schenley, Schenley, into a corporate behemoth. He was born in 1891 in Cincinnati, Ohio. Rosensteel dropped out of high school, went to work for his uncle in a distillery in Kentucky. Um, he turned to selling shoes and bonds during Prohibition. He accumulated enough money to afford to vacation in the French Riviera in 1922, because of course he did. He was lucky enough to be in, yeah, this is his story. So he says this salesman guy that sold bonds and had nothing to do with anything, just happens to be in the French Riviera because that's where shoe salesmen goes for vacation. And he just happens to run into Winston Churchill in 1922, who advised him to prepare for the return of liquor sales in the United States. Because you just give that advice to anybody. And the as Whitney says, the high school dropout turned distillery worker turned shoe salesman, um, just happened to come across British um, uh, leaders like Churchill on a beach. And so then it says that Rosenthal spent his next 10 years dutifully following the advice of Churchill, and he somehow convinced one of the most powerful banks in Wall Street, the Lehman Brothers, to offer him a massive loan to finance an acquisition of closed distilleries to accumulate whiskey inventories for the not yet materialized repealed prohibition. Yeah, that's swampland territory right there. And this was still while Churchill was the Secretary of State for the colonies that he's doing this. This is crazy. Rosensteel then incorporated Schenley Distillers Company in the wake of repeal in 1933, and he becomes one of the most powerful futures in distilled spirits in the U.S., supposedly on Churchill's advice. So Whitney says this narrative conveniently obfuscates any hint of illegality in Rosenthal's Prohibition era dealings and fails to mention Rosenthal's documented ties to organized crime figures or his role in the prominent purchase of Brofman liquor aside alongside Joseph Reinfeld and other Singram middlemen. Years later, James Kelly, chief investigator for the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee of the New York House of Representatives, testified under oath that Rosenthal had been part of an underworld consortium that bought Brofman's liquor and sold it throughout the U.S. during Prohibition. So it was never an innocent vacation on the Riviera. He was sent over there, and in my supposition, where this is all being orchestrated to create a monopoly in these industries, it was British all along that was manipulating the market both in Canada and the United States, both of which they view still as their colonies, along with organized crime. Meyer Lansky, as well as Joe Fosco, an associate of Al Capone's, and Joe Lindsay, a Boston based criminal associated with Joe Kennedy's bootlegging operations, were all part of this network. Rosenstiel was particularly close to Lansky. They owned points together in different mob operated businesses. He was closely related to Frank Costello, who attended meetings. One of Rosenstiel's ex-wife, this woman, God bless her, Susan Kaufman, later told journalists that, quote, living with Rosenstiel was to live with the command structure of organized crime, unquote. So she goes on to talk about different meetings that he had, and how close he worked with organized crime. And she went with him to different business meetings. Um, Fusco and Lindsay took their operations into both legal and legitimate business world, just as Rosenstiel had done, which is money laundering your ill-gotten gains into legitimate businesses. Um, so some of the people that he dealt with, Frank Costello, Sam Giancana, Santo Traficante, Meyer Lansky. Lansky addressed Rosenstiel as the Supreme Commander, a name that Roy Cohen, Rosenstiel's attorney and close friend, also used for the liquor baron. And we're going to talk about Roy Cohen a lot in the future. Rosenstiel's transition from bootlegger to businessman included a direct partnership with Sam Brofman. In 1929, Brofman invested $585,000 in Rosenstiel's own distillery producing medicinal spirits and had acquired a 20% stake in Rosenstiel's company. So Rosenstiel's distillery, according to Sam Brofman, was a piece of junk and looked awful and produced inferior whiskey compared to what Brofman felt he was producing in Canada. So he felt like he had been taken advantage of. Um, there was a tremendous toll taken on their relationship um, over some of their business dealings. And let's see, their feud would escalate and turn into basically a business competition of and either man noting that either man appears willing to sacrifice profit to do the other one in the eye. So Rosenstiel's name and business came up saying he had no admiration for the man, and he called him Rosen Smeal, which equates to born loser in Yiddish. Brofman's lavish Seagram's building in New York City had been planned to make Rosenstiel's 1930 style offices in the Empire State Building look like shabby dwellings. So Sam Brofman, so Rosenstiel, we're going to find out, was very much into blackmail. Sam Brofman, not so much. Rosenstiel, having placed bugging devices throughout all of his offices, he would fire somebody and go to the bathroom and record what those people said while he left them in their office. He was obsessed with blackmail. One of Rosenstiel's ex-wives held that Rosenstiel had also placed microphones throughout their home in order to record conversations that took place at elaborate social events that he had so that he could use the blackmail against his friends. She said the house was, quote, wired from roof to basement with hidden microphones so that he could spy on all visitors and staff, unquote. The system he had installed was installed by a man named Fred Otash, an infamous private detective who used electronic means to spy on the Kennedy family, Marilyn Monroe, and many others. He is quoted as saying, quote, the home, quote, was rigged to tape conversations for hours on end, unquote. Otash obviously had a thing for blackmail himself, particularly sexual blackmail. He had once attempted to entrap JFK using a call girl by the name of Sue Young in the lead up to the 1960s presidential election. It would probably not be him. He probably was working for someone to do that. Um, Rosensteel also sought out California-based Otash to bug his New York home. So sources that discussed Rosensteel's interest in blackmail also said that Rosensteel was bisexual. And guys, just a heads up, this is a theme throughout this entire book. According to Nicholas Fate, he said that Rosensteel's bisexuality among Shenley office employees was a very well known fact, and they behind his back often referred to him as Rosie. This also was verified by his fourth wife, Susan Kaufman. And you're right, Julie, she's very brave. Kaufman, whose previous marriage had collapsed because her first husband had been homosexual, she soon discovered what's the chances of that? She soon discovered that she had made a similar mistake by marrying Rosensteel. So he was uninterested in having sex with his new wife, but went to great expense to have her dress up in clothes that make her look like a little girl. That's another theme among these people. He would later be discovered in bed with one of his lawyers, Roy Cohn, and shrugged it off to his wife by saying, asking for some alone time with his attorney. I'm sorry, but never mind. I'm not even going to say it. I've never seen. Oh, and so Susan Kaufman supposedly responded, "I've never seen you in bed with Dewey, who was his attorney before," as she walked out. Kaufman remembered the young Cohn, who was best known for his infamous stint as Joe McCarthy's chief counsel during the height of the communist investigations that Senator Joe McCarthy investigated. And Kaufman remembered that Cohn had been flaunting his homosexuality whenever he was around Kaufman, openly caressing a former congressional associate in front of her and describing the homosexual antics of a close friend of his and Rosensteel's, who happened to be Cardinal Spellman, who at the time was the cardinal in New York, one of the most powerful figures in the North American Catholic Church. Cohn reportedly was so open with her because of her first husband having been gay, and he assuming that she understood that because she stayed with him for 9 years. So, um, Cohn, let's see what I got here. Cohn's grandfather funded Bank of the US, and that's going to be important in a little while. His uncle also went to prison for fraud. Cohn was part of the team that prosecuted the Rosenbergs for spying, and he died of AIDS. He was also disbarred because of some of his antics. So there's a lot of there's a lot written on Roy Cohn, and I know many of y'all know that he was prominent in President Trump's uh, presence in New York City as well, and we'll get into that a little bit. Whitney's not a big fan of Trump. I'll give you that as a warning. It doesn't negate any of the facts in the book, but again, in all of the books that we review, we do so objectively. I'm going to give you the information. You can do whatever you want with the information. But there was no doubt that Roy Cohn was gay. None. In 1958, Kaufman accompanied her husband Rosenstiel to a party hosted by Cohn at the Plaza Hotel in New York. Kaufman recalled entering through a side entrance and taking an elevator to the second or third floor. Her husband obviously had been there before, walked directly to the suite. This suite will be referred to as the Blue Suite in future conversations. And inside the suite was Cohn and another figure closely associated with both Cohn and Rosenstiel, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. To Kaufman's surprise, Hoover was wearing women's clothes and a wig, Cohn introducing him as Mary in a bout of barely concealed laughter. Mary was also incidentally the nickname that everyone who knew Cardinal Spillman's sexual escapades called him. Kaufman recalled seeing a couple of boys come in, young blonde boys that were around 18 or 19. Roy Cohn makes the signal that we should go into the bedroom. Sexual activities between the young boys Cohn and Hoover ensued, with Kaufman declining to participate. The Rosenseals then left, leaving the boys alone with Cohn and Hoover. Cohn later laughed about the incident to Kaufman, saying that Mary Hoover attends his parties regularly and would make sure to arrive at the plaza first with his clothes in a suitcase. Kaufman was repulsed by the whole affair, but ended up attending one other party because she was bribed with an expensive pair of earrings. Not a lot of scruples there. Kaufman resulted in considerable efforts. So, allegations made by Kaufman made people try to attack her testimony when it was later given, when she agreed to serve as a state witness regarding her ex husband's ties to organized crime. Kaufman was hit with an attempted perjury charge that was regarded as unprecedented and bizarre by lawyers and outraged the committee chairman and chief counsel. Kaufman still testified, but mostly behind closed doors. Her testimony decades later is still sealed. Attempt, Attempted perjury charges had been instigated by Louis Rosenstiel himself in order to prevent his wife from testifying. So that's very interesting. Um, Also, we're going to learn later on that Cohn's uncle, Joshua Lionel Cohen. So now Cohn spells his name Cohn. That's not actually how you spell his hereditary name. His uncle, Joshua Lionel Cohen, Cowen, and it's also spelled Cohen, is the guy that created Lionel Toys, the railroad. And Roy Cohn ends up with that company eventually, which we will get to in a future chapter. Um, the attempted perjury charges has since been used by some authors to discredit Kaufman's later testimony regarding her ex-husband. But the people that were administering that investigation, the New York judge and the committee investigator all said that she proved to be an exceptionally good witness and that the incidences that could be researched all turned out to be true. She was not caught in a single lie. And the fact that they sealed her testimony tells us everything because we know what that means. We're living through it right now. So, she possessed photographs showing Hoover in the company of Louis Rosenthal's organized crime associates as well. Those photos were later confirmed as authentic by several journalists. And she also said that she had suitcases of photographs that she had hauled away from her marriage to Rosensteel. The ones I saw showed Hoover, lawyer Roy Cohn, and Rosensteel in all sorts of social events with mobsters. So this is setting up the scene for the sexual blackmail. And the blue suite that was used at this particular hotel had been bugged by the same guy, and they had huge parties there to sexually compromise people. And what we should understand here is Hoover's sexual exploits was very well known in all intel um, entities and government and within the mob. And he was a very controlled FBI, and that's the reason why he stayed there for so long. Because they liked him being there because they controlled him. So anybody that tells you that there is good in the FBI is lying to you. That doesn't mean that every single person in there is a criminal, but the FBI is not good. It never has been good. It never will be good. Period. It needs to go. There's no constitutional authority for having an FBI. Period. All right. So New York Attorney John Klotz also investigated Roy Cohn for a case well after Kaufman's testimony. He independently found that the Blue Suite at the Plaza Hotel and its role in sex extortion ring after combing through local government documents and information gathered by private detectives. It allegedly involved minors as well as young men aged 18 and older. Roy Cohn was providing protection. This is what they found. There were a bunch of pedophiles involved. That's where Cohn got his power from, blackmail. Jeffrey Epstein is a drop in the bucket of this organization. Rosensteel and Cohn's activities in the Blue Suite, later determined to be Suite 233, comes from statements made by Cohn himself to former New York PD detective that was in charge of human trafficking and vice by the name of James Rothstein. Rothstein later told John DeCamp, and y'all recognize that name because John DeCamp is the state senator who investigated the Franklin scandal of the boys' home in Omaha shipping um, underage boys and girls to the White House during Bush Sr.'s administration. So they discovered the entire pedophile network out of a um, basically an orphanage in Omaha. And that same John DeCamp. So Rothstein later told John DeCamp that Cohen had admitted to being part of a sexual blackmail operation targeting politicians with minors during a sit down interview with the former detective. Rothstein told DeCamp, quote, Cohen's job was to run the little boys. Say you had an admiral, a general, a congressman who did not want to go along with the program. Cohn's job was to set them up. Then they would go along. Cohn told me that himself. Rothstein's letter told Paul David Collins, a former journalist turned researcher, that Cohn had also identified the sexual blackmail operation as part of, get this, guys, an anti communist crusade at the time. And what did I tell you in chapter one? Anytime they use the word anti communist, they're talking about Gladio. That's what they called it. So this is admitting that part of that operation, and we know that from what we found in Belgium, but they used minors to entrap people to blackmail them into doing what they want them to do as part of anti-communist, my ass. Okay, so Cohn stated that this sex blackmail ring was part of an anti-communist crusade coupled with Hoover's involvement in the Blue Suite events suggests that elements of our government, to include the FBI, may have been connected to a broader operation. Let's say it all together. Operation Gladio. So Rothstein's statements. So Whitney Webb interviewed Rothstein as well in 2020. He additionally told her that Cohn had told him that his role in this ring had originally come about because he himself had been entrapped and blackmailed, which is what we all suspect, leading Rothstein to feel some sort of sympathy for Cohn when you should feel zero. Come clean, take the sauce, and move on. American intelligence operatives and organized crime had competed and then collaborated to blackmail Hoover, which we see play out in this example. So Lansky was credited with obtaining the first compromising photos of Hoover in the 1940s in a gay situation. According to a former Lansky associate, they had pictures of Hoover, and Lansky's widow later claimed that her husband had acquired them, which were quote unquote hard proof of Hoover's homosexuality and used to neutralize the FBI threat to his own operations, unquote, speaking about her husband, Lansky's. The photos supposedly showed him having oral sex with the FBI deputy director, Clyde Tolson. Everybody supposedly that worked in the FBI at the time understood there was a very not necessarily all professional relationship between Hoover and Tolson, and that it was an open secret throughout all of Washington. At some point, these photos fell into the hands of James Angleton at the CIA. So, also, a couple of other agents had it, and they confirmed that it was him having oral sex with Tolson. But they said that Hoover's face was the only recognizable face. It's just that they were told that it was Tolson. And they were also told that the photos were taken in 1946. So Angleton, what's important about that is Angleton was the FBI guy in charge of the relationship with he was the CIA guy in charge of the relationship with the FBI. He also, we haven't done this book, but we will do this book. The book called Final Judgment. If you read the book about the book called Final Judgment, which is about JFK's murder, you will find James Angleton's name everywhere on it, coming and going. There are actual memorials in Israel to James Angleton. James Angleton was more of a Mossad asset in CIA than representing the CIA. So it's critical at this point to have Angleton identified as the guy with blackmail material on J. Edgar Hoover because that plays directly into the um, assertion that Mossad was deeply involved in the assassination of JFK, and we'll get around to that eventually. So, um, also, you have in here during this time, Wild Bill Donovan, who was the director of the OSS, and some people argue that he had the pictures originally. It doesn't really matter. The pictures apparently were everywhere, and everybody knew this. Um, the Kafauer committee also said it's possible that Hoover's appearance at the Plaza Hotel served as additional insurance for all of these parties to be able to do whatever they wanted to do. The realities of being blackmailed um, on Hoover's behalf, given that his private sex life had been known by the mob and the U.S. intelligence for years, um, provided that blackmail avenue. And what's hysteric, his, um, ironic in all of this, if all of us in the military going through these year-long, top secret, clearance processes where every bit of your life is examined and your clearances are denied for even having, in some cases, traveled to Russia on a vacation, literally. One of the guys that worked with me had his clearance declined because he simply had spent a week in Russia. That's it. His great grandmother, was of Russian descent. They immigrated here, and some family member had died. They went to a funeral and couldn't get a clearance. And here you have these people with access to every secret that we have, and they're so blackmailable, it's not even funny. It's disgusting, actually. Um, so it makes a mockery out of everything else we do. Hoover also had ties to a guy by the name of Sherman Kamensky, who helped run a sexual blackmail operation in New York that involved young male prostitutes. Kamensky claimed to have been New York bred, but federal investigators later found out he was from Baltimore. Kamensky had ties to Israel, having served in the IDF. So this is a defense guy from Israel that is involved in running a sexual blackmail operation in New York that started off in Baltimore. That's where Nancy Pelosi started off too, in the crime syndicate. So there was a ring called the Chickens and the Bulls. It was targeted by the New York Police Department. Let's see, by the New York Police Department. The ring targeted prominent men who were closet homosexuals throughout the United States, many of them married with families. But they would go into New York and have sex, probably with Kamansky's guys, um, and then they would blackmail them. So, included in the blackmail scheme was a Navy admiral, two generals, a U.S. congressman, a surgeon, an Ivy League professor, well known actresses, television personalities. The operation was busted and investigated in 1966 by Manhattan DA Frank Hogan, though the FBI, of course, took over the investigation, which they have no authority to do. The photos showing Hoover and Kamansky together soon disappeared from the case file. Kamansky successfully avoided arrest for 11 years, having disappeared from the courthouse undetected during his sentencing hearing. Now, those of you who've been with me for Operation Gladio understands that this is another indication that this is part of Operation Gladio because people walk right out of courtrooms. They walk right out of jails as part of Operation Gladio because the whole auspices of Operation Gladio is that they own the jails, like, that's how they kill people like Epstein in jail. They own them. They own the police departments, so they can walk out of a jail. They own courts, and you're gonna see some of that on how they buy the judges in here. It's despicable. And we're talking about shit going on in the 1940s. This is not new. The fact that we act like we're all of a sudden coming upon new, oh my God, the FBI is crooked. The FBI's always been crooked. The CIA's always been crooked. None of this shit's new. Um, okay. This guy just walks right out of the courtroom. He's gone for 11 years. And he's the guy that's, uh, he's a pedophile. He's bringing in underage male boys to have sex and set up people for blackmail. And he just walks away. Yes, he's luckier than Epstein. Okay. Why would Hoover have been involved in the activities of Kaminsky? Well, there's a few possibilities that Whitney points out. One of which is that Hoover had been blackmailed by Kaminsky, and that's entirely possible. She says it's more likely that Kaminsky instead had ties to figures in organized crime and that had already blackmailed Hoover long before. Another possibility is Hoover was cozy to a second sexual blackmail operation targeting closeted homosexual men because he sought to pad his library of blackmail material for both personal and professional gain. And that's completely possible too. Um, Hoover was well aware of the power that amassing blackmail afforded and was willing to indulge in taboo behavior at the Blue Suite because he no longer was concerned about being exploited because he had information on all the people that had information on him. So, um, Hoover's reluctance to tackle organized crime as the FBI director was part of this whole thing. He's not going to crack down on the people who he's actually protecting. And I don't know if it actually says it in here, but that admiral that they caught in that sting committed suicide when they came to try to blackmail him. Hoover's ties to Rosenstiel and Rosenstiel's close association with Roy Cohn in legitimate businesses as well as politics. So Hoover's relationship with Rosenstiel in the 1950s had Hoover attending Rosenstiel's blackmail parties, and the first cites the first Rosenstiel meeting taking place in 1956. The face-to-face meeting with the director in a matter of hours was okay. So this is basically talking about this Summers guy, Anthony Summers. So this is this young kid, yeah, like 20s. He's a nobody in Washington, D.C. And yet somehow within a couple of hours of him getting a hold of Hoover, he's in Hoover's office. So they believe that that was a result of him having been one of those people in the Blue Suite, and he gets real chummy with Hoover. So the Blue Suite parties and blackmail came to explain the ease in which a young Roy Cohn was able to meet with J. Edgar Hoover upon his arrival in 1952. And there's many examples of this when I was doing my independent research, but there seemed to have been like a almost like a harem, if you would call it that, of people that hung out in this network. So you've got Cohn visiting Hoover and being able to get right in and not go through any of the normal channels. Cohen at the time was in his mid-20s, and um, Hoover, who is supposed to have been talking to Cohen for the first time per several official accounts, is talking in I'm not gonna go into the conversation, but basically they're talking like they know each other, when supposedly the cover story was they had just met. Um, and one of the what another author says, none of the stories, turn out to be true because the only tie he could find between Cohn and Hoover at the time was a connection to George Skokolsky, Sokolsky, the director of the American Jewish League Against Communism. It's unlikely, also unlikely was Hoover's alleged urging to Roy that when you want to come see me, call me directly. Don't go through channels. And this author who's trying to make it sound like that's just impossible, that couldn't have happened, that can't be a true story. Um, Yet he doesn't realize the implications of all of the other aspects to it. And so Whitney kind of holds him to task in illustrating that uh, the context of the blue suite parties at the Plaza Hotel certainly makes both of those the early knowing him and giving him unofficial ability to see him, it makes it completely plausible that that actually happened. It is supported from press reports of the same period, that quote Cohn caught Hoover's eye unquote. Hoover, quote, showered Cohn with compliments and notes and photographs, unquote. So they had a very friendly, not professional relationship. They traded favors, compliments, gifts, elaborate private dinner parties. It quickly became Roy and Edgar. The official story also holds that the only bond initially shared between Rosenstiel and Cohn, a- as it is alleged with Hoover and Cohn, was a shared commitment to anti communism. Uh-huh. The bonds forged between this group of men who shared their forbidden passions in secret orgies, blackmail, organized crime, fostered a sense of camaraderie where you have Rosenstiel, Cohn, Hoover all kind of palling around together in the mid 1950s. So Rose Hoover sent Rosenstiel flowers when he got sick. Rosenstiel was heard telling Hoover, "Your wish is my command," in the middle of a meeting. I don't remember anybody saying that to me in a staff meeting. Um, I may just have not heard it. Um, so the same year, Louis B. Nichols, Hoover's number two at the Bureau for decades, was hired to become executive vice president of Rosenstiel's Empire of Shenley. That's the name of his company, Rosenstiel's. Around the same time, it was reported that Rosenstiel had bought large quantities of books about Hoover and distributed them as gifts. In addition, Rosenstiel had also bought no less than 25,000 copies of Master of Deceit, a book written by Hoover. In 1965, Nichols incorporated the J. Edgar Hoover Foundation. Rosenstiel was the principal contributor, giving the foundation 1,000 shares of Shenley stock. Nichols also gave a smaller yet unknown amount of Shenley shares to the foundation. The American Jewish League Against Communism, of which Roy Cohn was now president, gave a donation. A year later, The Rosensteel Foundation gave $50,000. The Rosensteel Foundation later would give $1,000,000, and bonds from a company called Glen Alden Corporation, which Shenley's Industry took over, made a donation. Um, Nearly everyone directly associated with Nichols in the Hoover Foundation is or was connected to the FBI's or Shenley's. The Washington Post reports in 1969 suggesting that something about the foundation's activities during that period was odd. Do you think? Rosenstiel began to retire, selling his controlling interest in Glen Alden in 1968, resigning as chairman and CEO of Shenley. Cohn would serve as Rosensteel's successor in matters of blackmail. It seems another man served as his successor in matters of business. Per Rosensteel's New York Times obituary, around the time he sold control of Shenley to Glen Alden and retired, he also sold his Manhattan townhouse, the one that was bugged for blackmail, to Israeli American businessman Rashulam Meshulam, Meshulam, last name Riklis, Riklis. Riklis was then an influential figure at Glen Alden. Riklis had absorbed so many companies, including Glen Alden Shenley in 1972, into his Rapid American Corporation, that he was forced to defend himself publicly because the allegations were that there's no way he had all of that money to buy all of those companies. Um, does that sound like money laundering? Making dirty money into legitimate companies, all part of the Gladio cycle? Yes. And it's interesting that what we know about the British setting up Israel and the whole Zionist movement that is operating the government of Israel, not on behalf of Jewish people, but on behalf of the British government, ends up coming over here buying into companies that are managing all the blackmail. Isn't that interesting? So this Riklis guy is a Russian Jewish person who moves to Tel Aviv and then to the United States in 1947. He worked at Piper Joffrey, who we just talked about in our last book. And in 1913, the other company that he was involved in, Paper and Company, was one of the companies that were doing lateral loans and brokerages that bought US Bank Corp in 1998. And it was later sold to UBS in 2006. So the um, all of those companies, some of the companies, y'all are going to die. I would recommend you look up this guy and look at all the companies that he bought, because he buys McCroy, um, and over 20 other very well-known companies during this buying spree, where it appears that he's taken dirty money and making and putting it into legitimate companies. Uh, so also, this same guy creates a holding company and gets all of his buddies, to include Carl Icahn. I should say the ones that I investigated were Jewish people. And I just think this is crazy, because this is it's not anti-Semitism. This is a Jewish man screwing Jewish people. So he gets a bunch of Jewish people to invest in a company that supposedly he advertised, that held all of the assets of all of these 20 plus companies he just bought up. But do you know what? If you read the fine print, It didn't carry any of the assets of those companies, just the name of the company. So he screwed all of those people out of their money, and they're fine with it. He drove the company to $2.9 billion in debt, but at the same time had protected all of his wealth. That's another thing that we see in these people that are into this money laundering. Like, a lot of people don't understand that when they create banks like the Castle Bank, and later on, the bank is like billions of dollars in debt and they close it down. Well, how does, if you're money laundering and you're just like depositing money in there to um, into numbered accounts and then moving it out of that to another, how does it actually go into debt? Well, the whole purpose of owning the bank is that in addition to money laundering of the money going in and out, so it's not traceable into like 20 different other banks and front companies and blah, 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 until it gets almost impossible to track the money. They are at the same time, let's just say on any given day, with all of this money moving around, they have $100 million. Well, they can loan out $1 trillion. They loan that $1 trillion out with no collateral to their buddies, based on a fake balance of money that tomorrow won't even be there. But today, where I can loan 10, that's why they do this, loan $10 for every dollar you have. That's why the Federal Reserve has to go away. So they create a bank, they loan the money, and then all of those people who have all of that, they didn't put a single dime, not like you and I. When we go get a mortgage, we have to put our house up, and you don't pay it, they get your house. These same exact people are borrowing money from a fake bank without any collateral at all. And so when they now have those billions of dollars that they borrowed from that fake bank and they didn't put anything up for collateral and the bank tomorrow goes under, they just have billions of dollars. That was the whole basis of the savings and loan. They're just stealing our money. And the black market money allows them to do it at a much grander scale, which is another positive facet of Operation Gladio for them, because all of that drug money, billions of dollars every year, is being laundered through fake banks who make loans to people based on no collateral. So you have to understand the enormity of the scale of this operation that's going on. Um, it would not, it's unfathomable that Operation Gladio would exist. But when you start exploring every tentacle of Operation Gladio, just the drug part of it is disgusting. Just the weapons part of it is disgusting. Just the money laundering is disgusting. And when you take the entire ball of wax that makes the entire thing move, it's it's overwhelming how corrupt and how many people are involved in this. And I rely on y'all to share this program so that every single one of your relatives, every single one of your friends, everybody understands what's going on. So when you read the news and you see what's going on in the world, you can put it in perspective. And there are people, my older sister is one of them, that when you share stuff like this, they get overwhelmed. They can only focus on the negative aspect of it. But I tell every single person that this thing is so big and it has so much shit inside of it. And Donald Trump came down the escalator into the shit pile and he started throwing shit. And there's nobody that throws shit like he does. Okay. So The fact that every single other presidential candidate, with the exception of Charles de Gaulle, that discovered the shit and tried to do something about it was couped or assassinated. They could do neither to Donald Trump. And the amount of crap that has been going on in the last 3 years is just them digging their hole deeper. They are doing to him what is going to turn around with a boomerang and be done to them. And it's just so crystal clear to me that that's what's happening. So I take all of this in a very positive outlook on where we're headed, but it's so important in order for us to negotiate the next year to understand the depth of depravity so that when people's heads start getting chopped off, nobody's going to feel sorry for them. Because what they have done to kids, what they have done to our country, what they have done to this world, there's not a firing squad. There's literally nothing that you could do to these people that could make me feel the least bit guilty of them not breathing the same air. That's it, because they're criminals. I want the criminal process to work. I'm not suggesting mob rule, but there has to be a process to hold these people accountable, and I believe it's coming. And I'm going to continue to share the information. That's the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3 is kind of where we start to get into some of the more interesting aspects. The name of the chapter is Organized Crime and the State of Israel, and it is very enlightening. So we will be back here on, you're right, nothing can stop what's coming. You're absolutely right about that. I think there's a lot of people that would want to stop, but they're not going to be able to. So we will be back here on Friday at 3 o'clock. And I look forward to seeing y'all. I hope you enjoyed it. Please give us a thumbs up and follow us so we can get more people exposed to the truth. I appreciate it. Share this on your social media if you wouldn't mind. Let them know that we've done other books that are found on my Rumble channel. And if y'all need anything at all, Julie Beans on Truth Social will hook you up with every link you could ever imagine. Thank y'all for being here, and I will see you on Friday. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Um, Again, thank you for being here.